I got a phone call just then, but I was saying the contour of the ground, following it with a weed eater, is equally as important as mowing when you're doing like boutique work, like not just keeping grass under control, but you're doing artistic lawn care, which is striping, because you want to get a good even cut when people are paying for it as for aesthetic reasons, not just maintenance, not just general maintenance, keeping the city off of them, but when you're doing artistic lawn care, weed eating is equally as important. So how you cut around the culverts, they're all different. I cut these in a V because it makes the most sense with the way the ground is laid around them. But you got to follow the contour of the ground when you're mowing. You got to cut the dips, where the deck doesn't follow it. Especially in ditches, you got to take the ridges out. Another thing is edging. Now, I learned this from a friend of mine, and I used not to do it years ago. But he showed me to knock the edges down on when you edge it with the edger and you mow it. You come back and knock the edges down with a weed eater. Now, I have actually adjusted this on my own personal yards that I do for myself, and I don't always cut it down on the edge because I think it actually looks better when it's just straight like that, when you can get away with it. But sometimes you can't. For instance, when it slopes down, like right there was a dip, I had to waste that. But like for instance right here, the edge of the yard slopes down. When you mow it straight with a mower and then edge it, it leaves these little sprigs sticking up, and you got to knock those down. So I've already done it there. I apologize. I wish I had shown you before, but it's little stuff like that. You've got to follow the contour. And like around this little sign, around brick and stuff, another thing that's very important is to weed eat it clean with the surface. And you can't leave anything sticking up, and it does use a lot of line. And I have tricks of the trade which I use to help me get that, but the main thing is you don't want to leave stuff sticking up. It needs to be completely clean with your surfaces that you're going around. And another thing is when you run into stuff like this, and a lot of people would say, or I even, do I edge this? Do I just weed eat it? Well, the bottom line is, if the level of the ground and the grass goes down below the concrete, you've got to weed eat it to where the grass is clean, flush up into the concrete with nothing sticking up. Now what I did here is I edged it, and then I knocked it down with a weed eater to the concrete. Right there, it dipped below the concrete a little bit, so I had to go with the weed eater and cut it down below where it's flush. And you have to be steady with your hand, and that only comes with practice, but you can do it. Another thing is when you have crepe myrtles, you always trim around the bottom because those little things grow up. But like right here, you've got to make sure it's clean, and going right to left will help you with that, on that kind of stuff. But when you're running the line long, I found that it's usually best to go left or right when you're knocking these edges down, and use the very tip of the line. You always run your throttle wide open when you're doing that because it makes it cleaner. But like right here, when you're dealing with a gravel parking lot, which really needs to be killed, what are you going to do there? Well, you can't edge it because it's gravel. So what I've done for years is I just will take the weed eater and clean that up like that, and use the very tip of the line with the throttle wide open. You take it very slow and carefully, because if you get in a big hurry, you're going to throw rocks and bust windows out, and that's going to cost you infinitely more than a little bit of extra time of being careful. But like right here, you can see that has to all be flush with the concrete. But you also don't want to scalp it into the ground when you're doing artistic trimming. So you got to have a steady hand. It only comes with practice, but that's equally as important as striping. And a lot of people, I don't hear a lot of people talking about that. Like right here, had to knock that down. As you can see, kind of, you see that contour, had to knock that edge down. But striping is important. And see here, I didn't go really overboard with the striping here, and I'm definitely knocking people who do. I respect that. I think it's just, you know, amazing, some of the stuff people can do. But at the very least, you want to have a good, consistent pattern, you know. And you've got to make sure the striping technique is to make sure it's consistent. Go look up the striping technique and you'll know what I mean. But one thing about the striping technique is, if you have a little bit of inconsistency in your mower, the striping technique will cover it up to where it doesn't show up so bad. For instance, if you have one tire that's a little bit low, going all the way to the edge like that, it'll be the same height on each stripe. And you only know what I mean if you know quite a bit about it. But that's one of the reasons. Another reason is, if you have like, say you have different types of grass, or say it just doesn't cut as good in one place, you can clearly see where you need to go, and you can go back over your stripes until you cut the grass that you didn't cut over the first pass. So you can clearly see where you need to go. It just makes it so much faster to do artistic, you know, aesthetic work. Now, if you're just knocking weeds down, don't worry about it, you know. Matter of fact, I've had people, especially older people, they hate the stripes. And it's harder to do their yard and do a good job, but in some ways it is, some ways it's not. But I just do the racetrack on it, you know, keep going over it till it's down, blow everything in the middle and mulch it up, you know. And then sometimes I blow it out with my blower because it doesn't disperse it evenly like stripes do, which is annoying, and it's a pain in the rear end. That's one thing about the stripes, is they disperse the clippings evenly over the whole yard. But at the very least, when you're doing the artistic work, the striping technique will save you a lot of trouble in the long run. And it looks decent. Another thing is, you want to make sure you go a different way every time you mow when you do your stripes, so you don't make ruts in the yard. That's real important, especially during the rainy season, you know, but also just for consistency. And another thing you can do is you can even cut 2 different patterns and double cut it that way, and you get all the ridges out, and that's a really smooth cut. And if somebody's paying good money for their yard, you know, I highly recommend it, because this business is highly competitive. And the biggest thing is, if people are paying decent money to get their yard mowed, they want a decent job, usually. Especially like people who know their stuff when it comes to lawn care. Like, some people don't, but I mowed a yard for some people this morning. They were some elderly people, and they knew their stuff. They knew exactly how to talk to me to make sure they got what they wanted. And I knew I better be on my best behavior here. Not that you should take advantage of people who don't know, because the people who don't know are going to have a lot of people who do know see your work once you do it. And that's why I don't like doing work for people who don't want good work, although I do, because I got to make a living. But people see your work and they're like, oh yeah, he did that. Oh, Andrew did that. Yeah, that looks bad, doesn't it? When they don't realize that the people didn't want a good job. As a matter of fact, they complained and asked me to come back and take the stripes out of the yard And I told them, I said, I'm not doing that. You know, I said, if you want somebody to do, I said, you can find somebody else. And they didn't. And I've never striped their yard again since that. But, you know, that's aggravating, isn't it? When you try to do an extra good job for people and they don't appreciate it just because of ignorance. It's like, well, kind of makes you feel just unappreciated, but you cannot get your ego involved when you're doing work. When you get your ego involved in business, I've learned the hard way that it's only going to end up costing you connections and money in the long run, you know. And so you got to just do the best you can with people and always pay attention to what they say, because they may say something and you don't catch it, and then they come back and say, well, I said this and that. Like, oh shoot, you sure did. You know, so you gotta listen to people really close, because their mind is in a completely different place as yours. And if you're not careful, you'll miss things that are important to them that you might not think are important. Like, you probably know what I mean. You know, like, some people are there like, don't do this. And they're like, oh yeah, whatever. And then you mess up and they're like, I told you not to do that and you did, so you're fired, you know. So it's a highly competitive business, lawn care, as many businesses. Electricians, probably not so much. But it's just the way it is in lawn care. So you've got to be, you know, you got to be on your toes. But you can make a decent living, you know, if you give it 100% and you're dependable, honest, and you do decent work. You can make a decent living, you know, if you really give it your 100%. But these little tricks and stuff that you learn along the way, they help tremendously, you know, like equipment. I could sit here and talk to you for a week about tricks I've learned in equipment and easier way to do things and stuff. But you'll learn that as you go, and you'll learn what works for you, and that's most important. But the main purpose of this video is to remind you that if you want to stand out from the rest in lawn care, stripes are great, and I see everybody doing stripes. I mean, that's great. I think we've come a long way on that, but don't forsake your weed eating. And many times I've hired people to run the mower for me, and I weed eat, because very few people know how to weed eat really good, you know. And I've only learned through hard knocks, and also because I really loved it. I've always loved weed eating, although it is tiresome when you do it day in and day out. But if you want to stand out from the crowd, you know, that's probably the easiest way you can do it. I would say even more so than stripes, because everybody's doing stripes now, but I see a lot of people still forsaking their weed eating. So, you know, as always, I want y'all to be successful, and I want to, you know, show you the ropes the best I can, because I don't know. I'd like to do this all my life, you know, but I'm sure I'll get to a point physically at some point where I can't really make a living at it, and I'll have to, you know, just scale way back or something, or, you know, hire people to work for me, which I probably will. You know, hire more, just, what do you call it, delegate more stuff out. But you got to be careful at that then, because I've seen so many people, they start delegating stuff out, and it's not too long before they delegate too much out, and they don't stay on top of their business enough, and they get a bad reputation. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. So really, if you're going to do lawn care, you need to be out here, you know, with the crew. If you have 5 crews working for you, or 10, or 20, or 30, don't matter. You need to be out here mingling with your workers and ramrodding your jobs. And, you know, also let the workers have credit for what they do. That's good. You know, that's very important, because we all want to have our own identity And I've worked for people in the past, you know, who didn't want to give me credit for nothing I did. I was out there busting my rear end all day, weed eating for them, and, you know, doing all the stuff that they didn't want to do while they sat their fat butt on the mower all day. And they didn't give me credit for nothing I did, and I got out of those situations as quick as I could. And also, they didn't pay me enough, you know. So if you're going to have people working for you, please take my advice, pay them well. Don't overpay them where the credit's not due, though, because then they'll get to where they don't get any better. You know, you need to pay people according to what they do good. And I can't tell you how many stories I've had of people who I overpaid too quick, and they actually left me and went to work at, like, you know, jobs where they weren't making half of what I was paying them. So I don't know why human psychology works that way, but it does. So, you know, you just got to learn the hard way, I guess. But hopefully I can share a few things with you where you don't have to learn so much the hard way, you know.